church services? As in, should we protest church services? I won't keep you in suspense. My answer to this question is yes. When the conditions call for it, when issues of injustice are so extreme that life is not business as usual, then worship should not be business as usual. But, I have some important caveats because even people of good faith and who largely agree that what's happening is evil, wrong, bad, can disagree on tactics, can debate methods. So we're going to get into that in this episode. Welcome to the Justice Briefing. I'm your host, Dr. Jamar Tisby. I'm a historian telling the truth at the intersection of faith, history, and justice. The Justice Briefing is a counter narrative to so much of the myth making and propaganda out there, especially in Christian circles. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. This here is going into the reason why we need truth telling, historical truth telling in particular. So, the National Park Service staff took down an exhibit on slavery at Independence National Historic Park in Philadelphia. And the exhibit was at the president's house site where George Washington lived as president. And the informational panels that were taken down discussed, you guessed it, Washington's ownership of enslaved people, as well as the broader history of slavery, and it included details about the enslaved person's lives. They took those down. What do you think of that? Is that something you are in support of? Is that something you think is just A-okay, just all right? Well, if not, then you have podcasts like the Justice Briefing and my Footnotes Substack. So if you want more historical truth-telling from an actual historian, the best way to do it is subscribe to my Footnotes Substack. Go to jamartisby.substack.com. You can subscribe for free, and then you'll get alerts about this podcast, the Justice Briefing, every week, so you'll never miss an episode. But if you want to take it a step further, if you want to actually not just be a passive consumer of this content, then you can become an active investor. Become a paid subscriber. It's just $7 a month, y'all. $7 a month. I don't know. What is that? We always use the cup of coffee example. I use the Happy Meal example. At this point, it's like a bag of candy, like one of those bags of snack size candy. Remember Halloween? That joint was expensive, but just one of those a month. And you can support historical truth telling. Go to jamartisby.substack.com. Y'all, there's so many ways to engage. I am producing content for you. So check this out. I also have something called the Tisby Justice Academy, where I produce my own courses. My signature course is called The Justice Journey. The Justice Journey, because justice is a journey, and it is about the journey, not just the goal or the destination. And what this is an 8-week live online course. We meet once a week, Tuesday evenings. We go through it. The subtitle is Biblical Foundations for Making Wrong Things Right. And then we go through the theology and Bible passages, but we also hit up the history and the sociology, and you get just some of my regular everyday spiciness to go with it. I think the best part of the Justice Journey live cohort when you join the course is the community. So a signature part of the Justice Journey cohorts is we break into small groups. I'm not just talking the entire time. We break into small groups once, if not twice, every class session. And those small groups are consistent throughout the entire journey. So you get to know these 3, 4, 5 people in your group really, really well. Last time we did this, we had 2 cohorts last year. Folks were exchanging email and phone numbers. They were setting up get-togethers online on their own, and they were looking at the end of the day for ways to continue on with their community. So if you are feeling the need for community right now, and what I said recently on social media, hope is a group project. We all need community. Stay on the lookout for signups for the Justice Journey. It does cost, but it's an investment. And if you go to jamartisby.substack.com, I'll be putting more details there lately. So if you're subscribed, you'll get it. If you're not subscribed, you're gonna miss it. Don't rely on the algorithm. Lastly, spread the word about this podcast. If this episode is helpful to you, if any of these episodes have been helpful to you, go ahead and post it on social media, text it to someone, put it in the group chat and say, hey, check out this episode. Uh, and that will go a long way. Cost nothing except a couple of minutes, if that. Share the justice briefing with the people you care about. All right, so let's get into this. The question is, should we disrupt church services? Why am I asking that question? Well, because of current events. In Minneapolis, we know that the federal government under this regime has weaponized ICE against everyone, not just people who are undocumented, but against US citizens as well. And in the wake of the recent and tragic murder of Renee Good, a 37-year-old mother in Minneapolis who was shot dead, shot 3 times in her car by an ICE agent, there were massive protests nationally, but of course, Minneapolis is yet again the epicenter. I'm so sorry, Minneapolis folks. Y'all have been through it. You had George Floyd and now this, plus many others. And you are resilient and we are standing with you. So I wish you didn't have to demonstrate this level of strength and courage, but here we are. In the midst of that, there were some people who lodged a protest. Several faith leaders called urgently for protecting the rights of immigrants. And so what they did was they found out this one particular church, City's Church in St. Paul, has a pastor named David Easterwood who leads the local ICE field office. So he's not even just a regular ICE agent, he leads the local ICE field office. And once these folks found out about it, they lodged a protest. About 36 protesters entered City's Church in St. Paul during a Sunday service. Some walked right up to the pulpit. Others loudly chanted, ICE out and Renee Good. And it caused a stir. It disrupted the service. Officials with the Minnesota Wisconsin Baptist Convention called what happened, quote, an unacceptable trauma. And they went on saying the service was forced to end prematurely as protesters shouted insults and accusations at youth, children, and families. So they were none too pleased with the protests. And it begs the question, was this the right, appropriate, best way to protest? So what's important to note is that even people who are unified in their disgust for ICE as an agency and the brutality that they are inflicting and the terrorism they are inflicting in Minneapolis and nationally, even people who agree that all of that is bad have disagreed on whether the protest was productive, effective, wise. And y'all, guess what? That's an okay conversation to have. Can we please have the maturity as people who are fighting for democracy and working for justice? Can we please have the maturity to say that we can be on the same team and still disagree in good faith? We can be on the same team and still disagree and not ascribe ignorance or malice to other people. It can just be intelligent people, thoughtful people, caring people disagreeing. By the way, this is exactly what happened during the Civil Rights Movement. Why do you think there were all these different groups, from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to the Congress on Racial Equality to the NAACP to the Black Panthers to you name it? It goes on and on and on. because they weren't all doing the same thing, and they certainly weren't all doing it the same way. And yes, they disagreed. And by the way, there were a lot of personalities and a lot of egos. The movement was not pristine, y'all, just like the movement today is not pristine. So let's at least have the conversation about why caring, intelligent people might disagree on disrupting a church service. So there are ways to protest during Sunday worship that don't actually impede on the ability to worship. Because the idea is, first of all, not everyone in the congregation maybe even knew that their pastor led the ice field office. Maybe they did, and they probably even celebrated it. But there's also the sense that Sunday morning worship for Christians or any other Sabbath day for another religion, those times are sacred, no matter what you believe or how much we disagree, because it's the idea that you wouldn't want them to disrupt your church services, your worship services either. Now, I'm just laying out the debate. You might be getting all hot and bothered and heated under the collar. Just listen to it. This is the problem these days. We think everyone who disagrees is the enemy. Not everyone who disagrees is the enemy. Sometimes they are, but there are people who are on the same side who disagree. So I'm just presenting it. I already told you what I thought at the top of the show, but I'm just presenting why there are people who might have a difference of opinion. So they just want worship to remain sacred no matter who's worshiping. That's what they're saying. And they don't want to set a precedent that anyone's sacred worship services can be disrupted for a protest. Now, in this case, it's a very clear case of justice and injustice, but maybe in other cases, it's not so clear. And then, you get into that area. And there are ways to stage protests that still gather attention. So one of the big issues with this protest was that the protesters, about 36 of them, entered the sanctuary during church services. So they came in the building. There are ways to protest where you stay outside on the sidewalk in a public area, holding signs, singing songs, chanting, praying, whatever it might be. There are even ways, and I'll get into this in a moment historically, there are even ways to enter the church service and essentially stage a silent protest. You're letting worship continue, but your presence is very known. And I can attest personally that when you are in a church service, it doesn't have to be loud to be distracting. So we kind of joke in modern day church culture, they record everything. So like there could be a camera, someone walking around with a video camera, getting people's faces and reactions during musical worship or during the sermon. And we joke online about how it's distracting with a camera right up in your face. That's not loud, but it's still distracting. It's still disruptive. There are ways to sit in groups or sit in a certain part of the sanctuary that still garner attention, but allow the worship service to proceed. So I'm just saying these are some of the things that others have brought up. And so the question is, was this very loud form of protest that actually stopped the church service, was that the best way to do it? Well, I can say this. It's easy to do armchair commentary when it's from a distance, when you're only observing through a screen, but you're not in the place where it's actually happening. So I think we should all approach this conversation with some humility. Are you hearing me yet? Are you hearing me yet? Like, have you totally shut down? Because the people who are so pro protest and disrupting church services, you might have your arms crossed and eyebrows frowning and you might be tuning me out already. Don't worry, for the people who think this went too far, your turn's coming. And I'm not trying to both sides of this. I'm saying that what they were protesting and why they were protesting was perfectly justified. What I'm doing is going through the ins and outs of it, but I'm going to make the case that, yeah, I mean, I'm not too bothered that they actually disrupted a worship service to the point that it could not continue. And I'm going to make the case historically. So here are some of my personal thoughts. If we think Oh, well, what if the other side did it? Motivation matters. So if the far right disrupted a church service, why would they be doing it? It's to defend oppression. So disrupting a church service to protest oppression and disrupting a church service to defend oppression, same tactic, but very different motivations. And I think one could be argued as justifiable, the other couldn't. You can't defend oppression, whether you're disrupting a church service or doing something else. That's just unjustifiable. That's not just hypocrisy, that is moral asymmetry. It is moral asymmetry. Those two are not equivalent. Just because you're using the same tactics, if you're using them for completely opposite ends, to protest oppression or to defend oppression, that's a moral asymmetry there. Same tactic, different value. And also, the axis is not disruption versus respect, right? Like this conversation can quickly devolve into like the civility conversation. Should we be disruptive and thus quote unquote uncivil, or should we be respectful and thus not disruptive? I don't think that's the right framing. I think a better framing is order versus justice. Order versus justice. Now, when I say order, I don't mean it in a positive sense. Historically, order has almost always been invoked to delay justice, and not to protect righteousness or uplift justice, right? So, order, that kind of order, which is delay, civility, niceness, versus justice. One of the key aspects to understand justice is who is centralized. Who is in the center of your reasoning? With justice, the people being harmed are central to your reasoning. And if you know someone or a group of people is being actively harmed, what lengths would you go to stop it? If a child is about to be hit by a car, would you break laws about jaywalking and rush into the street? That's an obvious example, right? Well, why don't you turn up the volume when Renee Good is shot 3 times in her car and killed? We're going to talk in a moment about a 5-year-old who's taken into custody, detained, kidnapped by ICE. When entire cities are being terrorized, what lengths would you go to prevent people from being harmed? Order versus justice, not disruption versus respect. Our criteria: is the cause just? And is the protest nonviolent? Now, I'm going to stick to nonviolence here because tactically it's more effective and morally I think it's more justified. Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. We're not going to get into it now. I do have a podcast if you go back. Um, this nonviolent stuff will get you killed. It's a book. I interviewed the author. This nonviolent stuff will get you killed. And you can hear more thoughts there. But is the cause just? Is the protest nonviolent? In this case, both of those are true. It was just, and even though it was disruptive, even though it was confrontational, it was nonviolent. There's a difference between disruption that testifies and disruption that terrorizes. We have witnessed disruption that terrorizes through the lawless actions of ICE over the past year. This is a disruption that testifies, that witnesses. Nonviolent protest that interrupts a service, whether that's silent disruption or vocal disruption or physical presence, whatever that disruption looks like, it's a testimony, it's a witness that says something is so wrong, normal rhythms of worship cannot continue. And it's easy to debate quote unquote appropriate protest from a distance. It's harder when you're the one living under the policies being protested. That's why I'm not going to sit here where I am in Louisville, Kentucky, telling folks in Minnesota who are under under law enforcement occupation through ICE what is and isn't appropriate. It's easy from a distance. Most critiques of protest in that sense are not about tactics, it's about proximity. The people closest to harm tend to be more disruptive because harm is already disrupting their lives. Listen again. The people closest to the harm tend to be more disruptive because the harm is already disrupting their lives. And we can't know until we're in that situation. So protest also isn't meant to be polite, it's meant to be faithful. And history shows that when injustice is normalized, disruption can become a form of discipleship, a form of moral formation. And I put this on social media. Reminder: protest is supposed to be disruptive. Now, I'm not saying every disruption is good, and I'm not saying there are no ethical lines that we should consider. There are. What I am saying is comfort is not the standard, approval is not the metric, and order is not the same as righteousness. The question isn't whether a protest lets worship continue. The question is whether worship can continue unchanged while injustice is named. And history suggests it shouldn't. So let's remember, why are they protesting in the first place? The murder of Renee Good. The autopsy came back. And this is from a Times article. It says preliminary results of the autopsy were described by lawyers for Miss Good's family. They said 2 of the gunshot wounds were not immediately life-threatening. 1 bullet struck Miss Good on her left forearm. The other bullet entered her body in the right breast, but did not penetrate major organs. The 3rd bullet struck her on the left side of her head near the temple. That was the killing shot. They're also protesting the generalized terror that ICE is inflicting. So did you hear this story about a 5-year-old boy, Liam? This is from a news article. It says Liam was coming home from preschool. His father was waiting for him in the driveway. They arrested and detained his father, and they apprehended him, the 5-year-old Liam. And then it says Liam was essentially used as bait. Quote, another adult living in the home was outside, begged the agents to let them take care of the small child, but the agents refused to let that happen. Instead, what they do, the agent took the child out of the still running vehicle, led him to the door, and directed him to knock on the door, asking to be let in order to see if anyone else was home, essentially using a 5-year-old as bait. This is why they're protesting. This is why they're entering a church service during the church service. Now, the far right, it kind of played into their hands. They're going to take this, twist it, amplify it, all of that stuff. The Trump administration, well, what happened was they arrested one of the organizers. Her name is Nikema Levy Armstrong. She's a black woman, former head of the NAACP in Minneapolis. She was one of the organizers. They arrested her with a quickness. Pam Bondi herself came out and announced that on social media. Now, mind you, they will not even investigate the officer who killed Renee Good. The Department of Justice is not investigating, and they're not cooperating with local law enforcement. But they, with a quickness, arrested this black woman who protested. By the way, it's not, I should have mentioned this at the top. This is not just any church. This is a far right church. It's in the Douglas Wilson orbit. This is the white Christian nationalist kind of vibe of the church. And so we don't know if the organizers knew that. We don't know how much they know about white Christian nationalism or the webs that connect these folks. But this is a very important church, not in the sense of that it was prominent, but it's in a very well-connected network of far-right operators, politicians, church leaders, all of that. So the response was even stronger from the far right because it's like one of their churches. It's in the SBC, Southern Baptist Convention, all of that stuff. Now, mind you, Nikema Levy Armstrong, is an ordained pastor, and she said this: how can you serve as a pastor of the gospel of Jesus Christ while overseeing the brutal conduct of ICE agents who are literally terrorizing communities in the Twin Cities of Minnesota? She says, how can you be a minister while overseeing the brutal conduct of ICE agents? That's why she, as a minister, was protesting. But where was the outrage from the far right when the Trump regime rescinded protections for churches and schools when it came to ICE? So, back several months ago, I think last summer, there was an order, and this is coming from an NPR article that says, quote, the Trump administration says it will no longer consider churches and schools off limits to agents tracking down and arresting migrants without legal status. The statement from the regime went on to say criminals will no longer be able to hide in America's schools and churches. First of all, they don't care whether someone has broken the law or not. They are arresting people who have never broken the law, and they are arresting U.S. citizens. So this idea that criminals will no longer be able to hide in America's schools and church, no evidence for that, period whatsoever. They're just spinning it. And secondly, where is all of the hand-wringing about deploying ICE agents to churches? Oh, well, they'll just stay outside. You know what they do? They intimidate people not to even come to church for fear there are ICE agents waiting for them. Or when they get out of a worship service, fear of ICE agents waiting for them. So maybe that's not disrupting the actual Sunday service, but it is disrupting worship. So where is all of the pearl clutching for the fact that these sites, churches, schools, used to be considered sanctuary, off limits for this kind of legal enforcement, law enforcement? And now, no holds barred. Every restriction is gone. No hand wringing for that. So miss me with the far right outrage about this church service being interrupted. I would also remind you, you need to keep that same energy for when church bombings and arsons occurred. You remember this, Black churches being targeted as sites of resistance and resilience, and white supremacists bombing it. You remember most notoriously the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama in September of 1963. I wrote about this in my first book, The Color of Compromise. It's in the very first chapter. There's a white guy named Charles Morgan Jr. who, in the aftermath, spoke to a group of all-white businessmen in Birmingham, and he asked them this: who did it? Who threw that bomb? Was it a Negro or a white? The answer should be, we all did it. Every last one of us is condemned for that crime and the bombing before it, and a decade ago, we all did it. So first of all, that bombing and the one before it and a decade ago, these church bombings were not new. There was already a nickname for Birmingham. It was called Bombingham. There was already a neighborhood in Birmingham called Dynamite Hill, where so many acts of racial terrorism through bombings had already occurred. Church bombings, arsons were already commonplace. Where was the outrage then? And then Charles Morgan Jr. goes on and points the finger at the church. He says the who is all the Christians and all their ministers who spoke too late in anguish cries against violence. He's saying, if you did speak up, it was too late to prevent a 16th Street Baptist Church bombing and the one before it and the one a decade ago. And he asked, did all those ministers visit the families of the Negroes in their hour of travail? Did many of them go to the homes of their brothers and express their regrets in person or pray with the crying relatives? Do they admit Negroes into the ranks at their church? History has the receipts. Y'all, I'm just getting started. I'm about to go in. You thought that was just the warm-up. That was the amuse-bouche. Watch this. So, we're talking about history. Let's talk about other times when protest was disrupted. I encourage you to pick up the book, The Last Segregated Hour, The Memphis Kneel-Ins, and the Campaign for Southern Church Desegregation, by Stephen R. Haynes. It's called The Last Segregated Hour by Stephen R. Haynes. The last segregated hour he's referring to is Sunday morning worship. And he studies a movement in Memphis in the 1960s called the kneel-ins, like kneeling down for prayer. Kneel-ins were interracial groups of students who went to a church to see if they would be allowed to enter the building and worship on Sunday. So picture this. It's a group of black worshipers and white worshipers, all Christians, maybe a group of 6 to 12, not a huge group. They go, they're not yelling, screaming, shouting, blocking doors or anything. All they do is walk up to a church, usually one of the big churches downtown, First Baptist, First Presbyterian, First Methodist, all those things. They walk up to the church doors and they simply see if they would be allowed in to this white segregationist worship space. Many times, they were blocked at the door by deacons acting like bouncers at the entrance to the house of God. Their sole reason for not allowing people into the church service was that they were an interracial group and they had black people with them. Turned away at the door, sometimes violently. Sometimes the protesters got into the church service only to be asked to leave. Sometimes they were able to sit through the service, but then afterwards saying, don't do that again. Sometimes the city created a new ordinance that levied fines and promised jail time to these interracial groups of worshipers. This is why it's always a moving target to say what is respectful protest, what is appropriate protest, because even then, these were completely nonviolent, non-disruptive in their behavior. Groups of protesters, demonstrators, all they were doing was they literally were just going to go worship. They weren't going to take to the pulpit and make a statement or anything. They were just going to do what everyone else was doing. The only issue was there were black people with them. They got turned away. Now, how many of the people on the far right expressing outrage at the disruption of a church service even know about the kneel-ins? As a matter of fact, I write about this in my book, How to Fight Racism, my second book. I write about the kneel-ins, and I write the story that Stephen R. Haynes told about the founding of Independent Presbyterian Church in Memphis. So one of these churches, there was a church called Second Pres in Memphis. Kneel-in protesters went to this church. They were refused entrance, but it caused a stir. It caused a debate within the church. And eventually, that argument went unresolved, and a group of church members split off from the church and formed their own church, Independent Pres. Why? To preserve segregation. They no longer wanted to be at a church that would even contemplate allowing black people to worship on Sunday with white people. And rather than allow that to happen, they broke off from the church and formed their own segregated church. Keep that same energy throughout history when we talk about disrupting church services. I'm not even done, y'all. I'm not done. I'm not done. Watch this. Let's go to the Bible. Let's go to the Bible. Let's go Old Testament. Proverbs 21 and 27. Proverbs 21:27. The sacrifice of the wicked is detestable. How much more so when brought with evil intent? The sacrifice of the wicked refers to worship, refers to offering sacrifice at temple and during certain rituals and holy days. And in Proverbs 21:27, it says the sacrifice of the wicked is detestable. Now, if you are working with ICE, doing what they're doing, and you're co-signing it, unless you are an inside agitator trying your level best and risking firing and arrest and fines, then you are complicit with wickedness. What ICE is doing is wicked. And so Christians like this Easterwood, Reverend David Easterwood, who leads the local ICE field office, is participating actively in wickedness. And what does Proverbs 21:27 say about that? It's detestable. I didn't say it. Bible says it. The sacrifice of the wicked is detestable, and how much more so when brought with evil intent. I'm not done yet. Let's go to Isaiah. I'm going to read this to you. Isaiah 13 through 17. In case you were not clear, let me just read this to you because it's very direct language. I warn you in advance. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 13 through 17. Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Sabbaths, and convocations, I cannot bear. Your worthless assemblies, your new moon feasts, and your appointed festivals, I hate with all my being. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I'm not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. Whoa. It just hit me reading this passage. Stop bringing meaningless offerings. I hate with all my being. They've become a burden to me. I'm weary of them. I hide your eyes from you in prayer. I'm not listening to your prayer. Your hands are full of blood. It just hit me. Maybe the question isn't whether we should disrupt worship. Maybe the question is, was it worship at all? Was it the worship that God values? Maybe it was worship, but not of the God of the Bible, not Jesus Christ. Maybe we should not be asking whether it was appropriate to disrupt worship. Maybe we should be asking whether it was worship in spirit and in truth. Because maybe what they were disrupting was full of meaningless offerings and incense that was detestable to the Lord. Maybe we should be pondering how to stop doing wrong, learning to do right, and seeking justice. I'm not done. Let's go to the New Testament, John 2, 13 through 17. John chapter 2, 13 through 17. You know this one. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Isn't it telling that Jesus reserves his most passionate anger for worship at the temple? This is where we see Jesus pretty much at his most emotive, at least in terms of being angry and upset. We've seen him weep, we've seen him cry. But in terms of outrage, he made a whip of cords and drove out the sheep and cattle. And then he didn't go around asking the money changers to stop what they were doing. He didn't preach a sermon there. What did he do? He scattered the coins. You can picture him just sweeping the money off the table. And he overturned their he literally flipped the tables. This is not a polite disruption. And that's not all. He did speak. And it's interesting that in the translation of the text, it comes with exclamation points. Get these out of here, speaking to those who sold doves. Stop turning my house, my father's house, into a market. Because, why? In other parts of the Gospels where it talks about this, because the temple is supposed to be a house of prayer for all peoples. And they were putting up bars and guardrails and requirements and money and all this stuff that impeded worship. And Jesus was none too pleased. In fact, his disciples, when they saw Jesus, this passionately, righteously angry at what was passing for worship at the temple, the disciples, the passage from the Hebrew Bible that came to mind was zeal for your house will consume me. Zeal for your house will consume. Zeal means passion. A white hot fiery love such that Jesus could not stand to see the temple defiled. And that's where we see Jesus at his most passionately, righteously angry. Isn't it interesting that we see that level of emotion, that zeal at the temple? One more part, y'all. I've been talking about protesting at churches since I wrote my first book, published in January 2019. And obviously I was drafting the book before that, so even longer. Here's what I wrote in the penultimate chapter of The Color of Compromise, the chapter called The Fierce Urgency of Now. The subheading is called A Civil Rights Movement Toward the Church. A civil rights movement toward the church. I'm going to read this to you because I know you can handle it. It's a chunk, but bear with me. Large segments of the American church have lost all moral authority to speak prophetically against racism because they continue to practice it. Yes, they do. This tends to happen in subtle ways, sharing the works of people who practice slavery without any context or criticism, continually hosting panels, conferences, and other events that feature only white men. Christian schools making peace with the presence of buildings named after racists or featuring their statues on campus grounds. Harboring an uncritical opinion that Republicans represent the, quote, Christian political party, in spite of increasingly overt racist rhetoric from the party's elected officials and other leaders. And the list goes on. In light of ongoing complicity with racism in the church, what is to be done? Shall we hold another conference, form another panel, write another book? At what point will Christians who are fed up with racism take more decisive action? Perhaps the American church should be the object of a mass movement for justice. Maybe a mass march for racial justice in our congregations is called for. Or Christians could conduct pray-ins in the administrative offices of Christian organizations and institutions that refuse to take meaningful action to eliminate racism. Additionally, Christ followers could boycott specific events, publications, or organizations until they concede to the demands for a more racially inclusive environment. Conducting nonviolent direct action protests toward other Christians and their institutions may seem offensive to some. They may decry such activism as divisive, disrespectful of the law, and militant. These objections echo the ones anti-racist activists have heard throughout American history. Change must come to the American church, and it's up to Christians who comprise the church to end compromise with racism within the church. It's up to us, y'all. And maybe before our protest goes to the politicians and the halls of political power, maybe our protest ought to be directed directly at the white Christian nationalist churches whose ideology enabled and supports and fuels all of this. And yeah, That's going to include nonviolent, direct action protest. It's confrontational, it's disruptive. But history has never been moved forward by people who waited their turn. The question isn't whether disruption belongs in church. The question is whether the church still belongs to a God who overturns tables. And a church more offended by disruption than by suffering has already chosen its God. The gospel doesn't ask permission, it interrupts. And sometimes faithfulness sounds like disruption, echoing through a sanctuary. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Justice Briefing. Remember to support this work by subscribing to jamartisby.substack.com. I'll catch you next episode.